Yes, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Networks for Nature. As Anne said, this is the fourth webinar in a series that's been put on by the White Peak farmers. And today's webinar, Rewarding Land Use Change, Payments for Carbon, Soils and Biodiversity, I hope is going to be informative and useful for us all, which I'm sure it will be. As Anne says, I'm Brian McDonald. I've helped to set up the Facilitation Fund and been involved with that since 2015 to where we are currently with over 135 groups with around 4,000 members of the farmer groups were set up to address and provide training advice to improve the quality of the natural environment where these groups are operational. It's a really interesting time and the whole range of issues around nature recovery, how we would respond to climate change and restore our ecosystems into a better state than what they are really raising and rising up the agenda. As I say, it is interesting times, and in addition to all the things that are happening around policy and resources for the natural environment, I don't know if you missed it, but there was a solar eclipse earlier today that was interesting, and we seem to have also moved in the last week and a half from winter straight into summer. So hence the change in attire from a woolly jumper to a summer shirt. But I hope you are enjoying the good weather and getting out and about a bit better as a result of that. So as I say, it's an interesting time. There's a variety of challenges we face, not least of which is a recovery from COVID. But climate breakdown, extinctions, the impact of free trade agreements, and many more challenges make these webinars very relevant in how we address and take things forward. So as I mentioned, a large part of the interesting stuff that's happening on policy and resources is flowing from the government's 25-year plan and how we bring that to life. So as I say, it's a very interesting time. So the 25-year plan, which brings a variety of new tools and resources to the table, and recognising the longer-term need for the administrative infrastructure to help fuel and drive the resources that we might have available is a critical part of the package of activity. And I'm hoping that today's speakers will be able to take us through sort of three critical component parts of some of that offer. So as I said at the start, we've made these webinars trying to be relevant to both the facilitators who are involved with the Facilitation Fund, the members, and anybody else who's involved in land use change. And as I say, the specific presentations today, I think, are going to be fascinating in taking forward some of these things that are happening now, are coming on stream very soon, and as I say, I think will be really interesting and informative to us all. So we have today Nick White, who's Natural England's Principal Advisor on Biodiversity Net Gain. We have Andrew Baker, who's going to be talking about the woodland carbon markets. And we have Emma Adams from the Farm Carbon Toolkit, who's going to be talking about soils and carbon capture. So I think, and the format is that each of the speakers will speak for 20 minutes. We'll run each speaker in succession. Can you log your questions or any observations you might want to reflect on the question and answer thing down on the bottom right of the menu bar on your screen? And yeah, I hope that we've got enough time for good discussion and able to attempt to answer all the questions that we have today. Any questions that we're not able to answer, we'll log and come back as part of the feedback from today's event, which will be recorded, and we'll provide an update after today. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Andrew Baker. Andrew, if you can unmute and share your screen and go on to your presentation. You have 20 minutes to tell us about the Woodland Carbon Quote. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brian. I really appreciate it, and good afternoon, everyone. I recognise a few of you in the chat already from previous webinars I've done, so I do apologise if I'm covering old ground, but as Brian said, I work for the Woodland Carbon Code team. I work for Scottish Forestry, which is the devolved administration in Scotland of the Forestry Commission, as most of you will know. And I am specifically looking at the implementation of the Woodland Carbon Code itself and how to go about that. So if you're a landowner, if you're a project developer, what sort of processes you need to do, what makes you eligible, what are the obligations under the code, and what's the point of it, really. So without further ado, hope you can all see this okay. So as I said, the first thing I'm going to be covering is what is the Woodland Carbon Code itself, looking at the eligibility for landowners to get involved, looking at the obligations for said landowners and what they need to do to maintain their obligations to the code for the entire project. A bit of a summary of the process and some of the costs, give you some vague figures just to give you an idea as to how much it costs and what the process is. Give you an idea as to how to group projects together, which is particularly important when you're considering smaller projects, anything below 2-3 hectares worth of woodland creation is definitely, it's important to try and get it into group to make the economics work. Then talking about the economics, look at the monetization of carbon units, and then also source of further information. There's no way in 20 minutes I'm going to be able to cover everything that you need to know about the Woodland Carbon Code. And so just as an aside, the first place to look is the Woodland Carbon Code website. It's got everything that I'm going to say written out far more comprehensively and legibly than I'll do here, I'm sure. But to jump straight into it, what is the Woodland Carbon Code? So essentially, it's the UK's government-backed standard for woodland carbon projects. And this is also alongside the lucrative grant schemes that are there for woodland creation across the UK anyway. Obviously, the 4 different countries have a variety of different grant schemes themselves. But the purpose of the code is it helps companies to become carbon neutral or carbon negative, companies and people. And it also helps the UK to meet their climate ambitions and their carbon neutrality ambitions as well. It's based on incredibly high standards and robust science. It's got a transparent registry in the form of the IHS Market Registry, which is an international international registry where you can see every unit, who it's been sold to, when it's been retired against a company's emissions. And then it's also independently validated and verified by either the Soil Association or organic farmers and growers. Now, the principle behind it, I've touched on it at the top there, but the main principle behind it is it allows for the generation of legally recognized carbon units. Now, 1 carbon unit is equivalent to 1 ton of sequestered CO2e. And so that is 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent that has been drawn out of the atmosphere and stored in the biomass of the woodland, essentially. The E represents equivalent, as I said, and that includes other global warming gases such as methane, nitrous oxide, and that sort of thing. So we've got this one standardized unit, which is then split into 2 types of units: pending issuance units, PIUs, and woodland carbon units, WCUs. I'll come on to those in a second and explain why what determines the difference between the 2 of them and why that's important. So as I mentioned before, I work for Scottish Forestry, who govern the Woodland Carbon Code for all of the UK. Forest Research provides the research, as you'd imagine, behind a lot of the models that we've got in place, alongside other organisations' research that we use. It's endorsed by ICROA, the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance, and I can't stress enough how important that is, because credibility in the carbon market is crucial. People will not buy carbon units unless they are confident in the integrity of those units, in the permanence and the additionality, etc., which I'll come on to later on. ICROA's endorsement provides that for us. Next of all, obviously, we work in association with the Forestry Commission, with the Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland, and then NRW in Wales. So, you know what we are. I mentioned the difference between PIUs and WCUs. So essentially, and logically, trees take time to grow. So if you planted 1,000 trees tomorrow, those trees aren't going to have sequestered 500 tons of carbon dioxide immediately. They take time. Growing trees are the things that really suck carbon out of the atmosphere. Then once they become apex, once they reach their apex size, generally the balance between respiration and photosynthesis is in balance. They are still sequestering a little bit, but it's that growth stage of the trees that really sequester most of the carbon. So what we do in the code, I won't go into the nuts and bolts of it for now, but just the science behind it is, if you plant a scheme and are validated by the Soil Association or organic farmers and growers, and your scheme is predicted using our carbon calculator to sequester over 100 years, 500 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Once it's validated, we will assign you 500 PIUs and no WCUs. You then have to verify your scheme at year 5 and then every subsequent 10 years for the entire duration of the project. So what that means is, in year 1, you will have 500 PIUs and no WCUs. And then every verification from that point onwards, a proportion of those 500 PIUs will be converted into WCUs, woodland carbon units. So by year 100, you will have no PIUs left and 500 WCUs locked into the biomass of the trees. That's what that's meant to represent. Now, the difference for the landowner, the seller, isn't hugely important, really. They're generating carbon units, but for a buyer, it's critical, because the type of unit they bought determines what claims they can make based upon them. And so if I was a company and I had 500 tons of carbon dioxide emissions this year, and I bought 500 woodland carbon units, WCUs, I could say that this year I am carbon neutral. If instead I bought 500 PIUs, all I could say is I am working towards carbon neutrality. Now you can see how important that becomes, not only from a marketing perspective, but also from a legal perspective, if they are going to have carbon taxes on their carbon emissions, when you've got emissions trading schemes in the UK now, those sort of things become very important about what actually you can claim against them. So that, I hope, is clear, because that is the fundamental part of the Woodland Carbon Code. And then finally, I just wanted to show you this picture, because a ton of CO2 is bigger than I thought it would be, and I think that represented quite well. So eligibility. It's only for new woodland creation. So for existing woodlands that you may say, well, if I change the management of the woodland, I might be able to sequester more carbon. At the moment, we may in the future, but at the moment we don't assign any carbon units to that. It has to be new woodland creation. So sorry if that bursts any bubbles. There's no minimum or maximum area, but as I mentioned before, economies of scale wise, the bigger the area, the cheaper it's going to be on the whole generally, but with effective grouping of schemes, you can get over that. So the smaller schemes can group together with many others to become a substantial size between them, reduces costs, makes things more effective, makes things cheaper. It can include natural regeneration, and we've just released some more guidance on that to explain the process. It's a very similar process, it's just a couple of minor differences there. Hedgerows aren't included at the moment. Now, I know that in the past that they have been in certain schemes, but at the moment we don't include them because it is, as you can imagine, the science behind it is quite complicated. But once we are more confident in the robustness of the science, we will hopefully be able to start assigning carbon units to that as well. And it must be additional. Now, this is a very contentious topic at the moment. Essentially, what additionality is asking is, would the woodland have been planted regardless of carbon finance? And that is essentially just the sale of your carbon units. So without the carbon code being there, would you have planted the woodland anyway? Now, as you can imagine, it's incredibly difficult to prove or disprove that question, which is why we have several tests, which I won't delve into, but the main two, which I will delve into. First of all, there's the legal test. And so there's the question, would you have to legally plant that woodland there for any reason? So the most common reasons are restocking. If you've clear felled a site and planted, some people would think, well, that's new woodland creation. Well, it's not. You're restocking and you have a legal obligation to do that. Not eligible for carbon units. Compensatory planting. If I built a road, cut down a hectare of woodland, and then compensatory planted another hectare elsewhere, again, not eligible. So then looking at the next most important test is the investment test. Now, the investment test is basically asking the question, would it have been planted without carbon finance from purely economic perspective? So you look at the economics of the scheme and you're essentially comparing your woodland creation against an existing land use or an alternative land use. So if you were making £100 per hectare per year from farming, And then if you were to plant your woodland, you'd only be making through timber sales, like discounted back, £80 per hectare. You could say, okay, well, that doesn't make sense to plant that woodland without economically, without us giving you a little bit more money through the sale of carbon units. You are additional. But if you're making money hand over fist from some fantastic timber prices, that sort of thing, and you were going to be making £250 per hectare averaged out at the moment against 100, then we'd say, well, you'd be mad not to plant the woodland anyway, so we're not going to give you carbon units. That's the principle behind it. Don't worry about it too much. It's just, well, maybe you should, but it's just, that is something that we have to check. I mentioned that ICRO endorsement before. That is a key part of all carbon credit schemes internationally. So next of all, looking at the obligations for a landowner. First and foremost, you must replant in case of catastrophe if you're in a woodland carbon code scheme. And the reason I mention this first is because under existing grant schemes, if I had a woodland creation grant through Countryside, for instance, and I had a payment of 10 years, I would be obligated to replant in case of catastrophe for the duration of that grant scheme. After that grant scheme has ended in year 11, if the entire woodland burns down, legally, I'm under no legal obligation to replant it. I could just say it's a real shame, but I'm going to let natural regeneration take its course. You're well within your right to do that. If you're a woodland carbon code scheme, you must replant it. So that is an important difference. And particularly for 100 years, you can imagine for some of these woodland creation schemes, it can be quite significant. Most of the risk for fire is in the earlier years anyway, but it's still an important consideration. You must verify your scheme at year 5 and then every subsequent 10 years, as I mentioned before, with either soil association or organic farmers and growers. Next of all, you must manage your project as you outlined in your initial carbon calculations and management plan. And so if you were to make changes to that, it's a bit ambiguous there, because if you do want to make changes as time goes on, you say, well, I wasn't going to thin the woodland, for instance, but now I actually think silviculturally would be the best thing to do. You can do that. Bear in mind that your carbon figures may change. And so if you've sold all of your carbon units up front, you're kind of tied into that management plan, because if you thinned your woodland, you're going to be assigned fewer credits. And so there is flexibility there, but one of the things to do is maybe be conservative with the sale of your carbon units, so you have that flexibility. You must manage the UK forestry standard, and you potentially may have to buy back units if you've sold all of them. I mentioned just then, essentially that's what I was explaining. If you were to have thinned your woodland and you shouldn't have, and you've sold all of your carbon units, you may have to buy other units from elsewhere to replace those units, if that makes sense. So just something to be aware of. Next of all, a summary of the process and some of the costs associated with it. So before you plant, well, as of July 1st, so you've only got a few weeks left, all registrations with the Woodland Carbon Code must come pre-planting. At the moment, we allow registrations from planting that began up to 2 years ago. And so if you have some woodland creation that you planted a couple of months ago, you're intending to register with the Carbon Code, but just have never got around to it, register now, because as of July 1st, that will become ineligible. As of that point, you will have to register your scheme with us for free, pre-planting, sorry. Then you plant your scheme, and within 3 years of that registration, you must then validate your project. And that is essentially just an off-site check from the validation bodies, where they check all of your paperwork is in order, that you have the permission to plant on the land, etc., etc. At that point, if you were successfully validated, you are assigned all of your carbon units. At year 5, after the planting, you then must verify your scheme, and you must do this every 10 years. Now, depending on how risky the scheme is and whether it's been grouped together, the size of the scheme, etc., this can be an on or off-site check. Generally, over the course of the project, you'll have at least one on-site check, but sometimes you can have many, sometimes you can just have that one, depending on the scheme. Now, there are costs associated with all of those, which is important to talk about. So first of all, as I mentioned, registration is completely free. However, if you go to a project developer to do this for you, because it can be quite complicated, you may have to charge them a fee. And as I'm aware at the moment, that can range anywhere from nothing to £300 plus VAT sort of price. So just be aware of those. That's why I've split it into direct and indirect costs. A direct cost to either us at the code, the validators, or the market registry. The indirect costs will be if you need assistance through project developers, which I'd encourage you to do because they are masters of their trade, and it is a very complicated, or can be a very complicated process. But if you want to go it alone, you don't have to worry about those indirect costs. The next stage at validation, now the reason it ranges so much from £300 to £1,300 is because of grouping. I'll come on to that later, but essentially the more effectively you group, the cheaper it will be. And again, that's why those indirect costs for a project developer range quite significantly. And then again, when it comes to verification, these prices are likely to reduce as time goes on because of more innovative ways of measuring your woodland carbon through LiDAR, drone technology, and that sort of thing. But at the moment, it can cost up to £1,300, and that could be every 10 years. So if you are looking at a 100-year project, you can be looking at a significant investment in the code, up to 15 grand or so. And that's just direct costs. So be aware of that. Grouping projects together, I thought I'd touch on quite briefly now. I know we've got a couple of other speakers to come in, so I don't want to take too much time, but essentially, the grouping of projects is literally a marriage of convenience. A lot of people worry, well, if my project is doing really well and someone else's project that I've grouped with burns down, am I liable for their losses? Absolutely not necessarily. If you were to group it together and put a legal contract in place that said we are all in this as a collective and we all share liability and potential gains, then yes, you may be liable. But generally, when you group together, it's usually as simple as a marriage of convenience. I'm my project, a completely distinct project from that one. We are simply in the same group to reduce costs, which is absolutely fine. You can have up to 15 standard projects, which are any projects 5 hectares or above, plus up to 50 hectares of small projects, which is anything below 5 hectares, in the same group. So you can see quite quickly how those uneconomic half a hectare, 1 hectare schemes that are being put forward can really quickly be brought together to reduce costs with, you could have 15,000 hectares worth of standard projects if you wanted, and 50 hectares of small projects. Absolutely fine, all in the same group. It can be any type of project. They don't need to share the same nature in terms of mixed broadleaves or commercial conifer. They must be planted within 5 consecutive years of one another, but you can group them post-registration or post-validation. So it's just important if, as I mentioned, you're tight to that deadline of July 1st now, get your registrations in, worry about grouping later, not a problem at all. And as I said, can significantly reduce ongoing costs. Now, the monetization of carbon units, obviously very important. So there's a variety of ways to do this, but first and foremost, how much can you actually make on carbon units at the minute? Because carbon prices changes enormous. Carbon prices are changing enormously as time goes on. So the main you can generate. Say again?
2 minutes.
I'll be fast. I'll fly through this section, Brian. So prices are currently ranging, I'll speak as fast as I can, between £6 and £25 per tonne. You can generate anywhere between 100 to 500 units per hectare. And that depends on a variety of factors, the species you plant, the management regime, and that sort of thing. And so you could be looking at anywhere from 600 to 12,500 plus per hectare. And that's just with carbon prices as they are at the minute. They're expected to increase, but they may not. So it's important to be aware of that. Next of all, looking at the different factors affecting carbon price. So the closer you are to a city or to businesses, the higher the price will be, rather than a remote area generally. The nature of the project, some companies like mixed broadleaves, some companies like commercial schemes. The vintage of the units, and so some of these PIUs will be converted earlier than some of your later PIUs. Those earlier units are more valuable than the later units because of the claims companies can make upon them. The flexibility you have as a landowner to the company, if they say, can we put up some signage, can we have public access, that sort of thing. If you're flexible to that, then your units are going to be of a higher value. The stage of your project, whether you're before planting or post planting, can make a difference as to what the companies would likely pay. And it's all governed by this private investment. There's no flat fee as this is the price of carbon units. It entirely depends on what a company is willing to pay for your carbon units. And then the associated benefits, which can be tracked using our Woodland benefits tool. And so you're scored for each of these out of 1 to 5. And the higher you score, the more valuable your units will be to these companies. Next of all, looking at the general questions about monetization of carbon units, my second last slide, Brian, You can sell both PRUs and WCUs, and you can sell them at any time in any quantity. So if you had 1,000 PRUs assigned to you in year 1, sell 200 today, 500 in year 10, whatever you decide to do. It's a commodity that you own that you can sell to whoever you like. It depends on the vintage, as I mentioned before, as in which carbon units that you'd like to sell. You can sell to anybody looking to offset their UK-based emissions. So if you have a company that is solely working out of France, they can't buy your carbon units. They could invest in your Woodland, but they can't buy your carbon units. And a lot of companies now will be more innovative with their payment methods, rather than just saying, I'll give you £1,000 up front. They'll say, well, how about I pay you £200 per hectare for the next 20 years, and we get all of your carbon. So they're trying to make it more flexible for the farmers, and the cash flow wise, make it easier. We're working at the code ourselves at the minute in terms of automating sales. So you can just put your carbon units onto a registry at a certain price, and then companies can just click through and just buy them themselves immediately. And you can bundle or stack these other credits with grants, with biodiversity credits, with nitrate offsets, and that sort of thing. And the Woodland Carbon Guarantee you may have heard of, that is essentially simply a government backing to say, we will buy your carbon units for a certain price if you're successful. Only about 30% of the people applying to that will be successful, so don't worry about that too much. And then as final point, further information, look on our website, look at the resource on our website, and go to a project developer, again on our website, and ask them for a bit more information. They'll be happy to help. Brian, I'm done. I apologize for going over slightly, and I will pass back to you now.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Yeah, it's a challenge, but each speaker's got 20 minutes, and it is sometimes hard to squeeze in as much detail as you can in that slot. But we have a number of questions which we'll come back to at the end. So please keep firing your questions into the Q&A section, and we'll attempt to answer them later. And as I said before, anything we can't answer now, we will get back to you as part of the dissemination recording. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Emma Adams from the Farm Carbon Toolkit, who's going to be taking us into the world of soils. So from the canopy and trees to the stuff that things grow in. So over to you, Emma. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'll just try and share my screen. Okay, so as Brian's kindly said, my name is Emma Adams, and I work for the Farm Carbon Toolkit as a farm carbon and soils advisor. So all things digging around and being out on farm, helping out lots of farmers and other advisors like yourselves. So where do we come into things? So obviously we're all aware of the UK agricultural emissions and how this is climbing political agendas, and is really becoming a part of the sort of vernacular that we're dealing with as advisors. So when we're looking at it from our perspective at the toolkit, it's to try and understand and identify where emissions are arising from on farm, and then from there understand what our total farm carbon footprint is. So from this side, I'm sure many of you have seen it already, it's the UK agricultural contributions to the emissions, and from that, the split of where they arise. So agriculture responsible for 10% of the UK's emissions in, well, these figures are from 2020. So of that breakdown, the biggest contributor is the nitrous oxide. So it's often one of the headlines due to its very high greenhouse gas equivalent score. But looking at these figures, they're actually improving. So that's good, because we used to be responsible for 78% of the nitrous oxide emissions. So we are reducing it, which is always good to know. So yeah, as you can see, methane, another very hot topic, and especially with livestock and agriculture. It's one of the gases that we're looking at, and the sort of methodology of how it's recorded and how we sort of understand it in the ongoing science. So where does this leave us? So again, many people will be aware of the policy, and we've got other speakers who are going to be far more clued up than I am on this bit. But the policy and how it affects my job and my work with farmers is how we're going to reduce these emissions. So understanding what we're producing, what we're sequestering, and how that's going to fit into any future sort of land-based policy, and what we can do on farm to keep our businesses nice and resilient. So the future of UK agriculture Again, policy-based, how is net zero going to be implemented? It's become a statutory requirement in UK legislation, and we've obviously got our net zero target of 2050 and recent announcements to try and reduce it up to 78%. So it's a good challenge for us, and it's all about understanding what we're doing on farm and how we can either reduce, reuse, and sort of optimize these systems that we've got without obviously changing the inherent face and ongoing practices that we're doing in agriculture too much. So this all comes back to nature-based solutions. So we've got this fantastic opportunity in the UK of this very diverse farming landscape. So what can we do with it, and how can we improve our soil health and our drawdown of carbon through things like our forestry and our woodlands, and things like optimising our soil organic matters and our grassland rotations. So it's all about sustainable farming approaches to increase productivity alongside environmental protection. So it's, again, the resource optimisation, the reliability on farm, and overall business resilience. So again, as I said, it's carbon and emissions are so within the sort of global conversation at the minute, and within the UK we've seen lots of our producers and our consumer drive to be within carbon. Lots of mention of greenhouse gas, and obviously as farmers we need to make sure that the people we're supplying are being met to contracts. So we've got supermarkets like Sainsbury's releasing statements about how the focus of carbon is within their business, and then also livestock side, many of you will have heard of ALA and their increased payments if you've done sort of carbon footprinting. And then also big multinationals like Diageo, who lots of our arable farmers will be supplying their barley to, wanting to have a low carbon supply chain. So it's inescapable, and here at the Farm Carbon Toolkit, we like to have a look and see what we can do to help. So how can we help? So the toolkit overall, we have a few different factors within it. So we have our overall calculator where we calculate farm emissions. We have a big toolkit of resources on the website where we can look up various different fact sheets and pages of what we can be doing on farm, practical advice of how to save emissions and increase sequestration. So overall, we can answer some questions and hopefully help with the future. So the carbon calculator, it's developed by farmers for farmers. So our board of directors are all actively in farming, which is very useful because we're very close to the ground, seeing what's going on out and about. And for that, for farmers, it's free to use. So it's an online tool where you can go on, log on, and produce a carbon footprint of what your business is currently emitting and sequestering. From there, you can either have a bit of help from us guys who can help you interpret your results, or you can just see what it is and go about it on your own way and keep on recording and measuring what's going on. So as previously mentioned, to calculate your farm footprint, you need to know your emissions and your sequestration. So for soil sequestration, this is obviously a very emerging sort of area where you can take some footprinting will use models, whereas you can also use actual sample measurements of organic matter and soil carbon percentage. So the calculator, you can sort of use whichever one you like, really, but it's an ever-emerging field. So it's, yeah, very interesting to involve with. So at the calculator, we are currently working on a big farm net zero project to understand soil carbon on a national scale and to refine these models. So the calculator, as ever, is only going to be as useful as what you measure. So it's a dynamic tool, so you can continually update it and monitor it and see how different farm management systems implement and influence the different emission outputs. So footprint is provided as CO2 equivalent. So as we've just heard, very important measure. And although we call the carbon calculator, it gives you a figure of CO2e, but that also is an overall measure of your methane, nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. And finally, the new methane technology, which is very important for our livestock farmers. So we're currently working on the GWP 100, which is working on a 100-year global warming potential of the greenhouse gases, whereas the new methane methodology, the GWP star, can see reductions of up to 75% of the emission total from methane. So for livestock enterprises, it can be a big difference of the overall farm footprint. So how does carbon footprinting work? So as ever, if you can't measure it, you can't monitor it. So first you have to gather the data, which will be anything from fuel use on farm to number of sheep and how they're kept, so number of days in versus out, whether they're on slurry or straw. We can measure as much as you or as little as you like. So it's a brilliant tool to be that dynamic. And from there, we take the data into the calculator. Anything slightly missing, we can make assumptions for and refine to calculate the footprint. It's only as useful as the data put into it, but equally, it's a tool designed to be helpful for the individual farm business. So if we say an assumption of a certain number of trees, but that we might say 35 infield trees are sequestering this amount because they've got a crown area of so much, but really you've only got 33 trees. If it's your farm business and it makes sense to you, then that's okay in our eyes. So it comes down to assessing what this tells you. So when it comes to the farm business decisions and the resilience, it's understanding where emissions are sourced and how we can either sequester or reduce them. So again, developing a strategy for reducing emissions. And as ever, measure to monitor, and annual assessments are always useful to see how your footprint is emerging over time. And equally, as new sort of methodology and ever-expanding knowledge base is going to be engineered into the calculator, it's only ever going to get better. So what do our reports look like? So this is for my lovely 100-cow dairy herd. So when you enter in all of your information, this is what the beginning of the report looks like. So you have the blue bar of your emissions in tons of CO2 equivalent. On the left-hand side, you have your total offsetting in the middle, and then your overall carbon balance as a total of the two. So the emission score for this farm would be carbon negative, so it's sequestering more than emitting, and they are sequestering 443.06 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year. So it's doing quite well. So, there we go. So this is just a bit further down in the report. So our carbon balance here is then broken down into the equivalents on a per hectare basis for this unit. I believe I made it perhaps 200 hectares, something like that. So that's our carbon breakdown on a per hectare, per tonne of product. So it's a dairy farm, so that is including milk yield. But if we had, say, a arable farm, that would include, the product would include tonnes of grain or meat or whatever else is being produced, and then divided down by your carbon balance. Fuel use per hectare, that's always very interesting to see sort of how fuel efficient we're being. And then again, as mentioned, you can take it down. So if you had a dairy farm which also had a beef and arable enterprise, you can know your total balance per tonne of product, but then individually on a milk basis as well. And similar to the fuel, fertilizer emissions per hectare again. So it's all about the sort of resource optimization and our efficiency, again with water. You'll see carbon income's blank on this one. I will talk about it a little bit later, but this is sort of one of the emerging areas of the calculator. So it's not always included or that useful for everybody. And then finally on the report, it does go into more details of individual contributions of each element, but the headline figures are always mentioned of emissions versus offsetting or sequestration. And you can see from which areas of the business you're getting the highest contribution of emissions. So in this one, it would be inputs, crops and livestock, which is pretty typical. And then again, offsetting. So in this report, I have got some sort of organic matter data. So that is providing the lion's share of the offsetting. But equally, we've got our field margins, habitats, hedgerows, and recycling. That's always a good one. So make sure you're doing farm recycling. Okay, so this is how the report looks. So you would enter in your data here, on a category by category data basis and entering your data. So here we've got our diesel and electricity as an example of what quantity equals what quantity of emissions equivalent. So as ever, you can use details or lacking in detail as you like. It will just add more and more wedges to a circle, which from the categories then contribute to the overall total for the reports. Okay, so this is another example. This is the sequestration side, where you have your multiple different elements and how they all contribute. So it's a good overall measure, and as ever, there's a running total of your emissions and then your offsetting there. So very useful to see both sides of the business in one tool as a live sort of remit, and also quite useful for planning things like your stewardship schemes to see what your carbon balance would be when you do things like our lovely woodland planting schemes. So how does this all relate? So the carbon calculator is an aim to understand your emissions against your sequestration. So the target is obviously to get to your farm net zero, or even better as a negative balance, so you're sequestering more, and it's constantly trying to find the balance between your emissions and your sequestration. So how can your fuel and livestock management be influenced either by your sequestration, or what can we look at to sort of look at the overall farm productivity as a measure of its carbon output. So final section, just looking at markets for carbon offsetting. So unfortunately for soils, it's not as clear cut as it is for woodland. So although we can understand our potential emissions and our potential offsettings, there is no validated market currently across the UK. So at the minute, it's a process of understanding what we could have and what we could do with potential future markets. So there is currently direct selling to consumers, and it is also used for product differentiation. So within the supply chain, knowing your carbon footprint. So as mentioned before, things like the ALA programme, where knowing your carbon footprint can give you a commercial advantage. And then finally, it's the voluntary offsetting. So if you understand your farm business and it's something that people take interest in or want to be earlier from the market, understanding how much you can actually sequester and what your soils are doing for you. So as mentioned, you've seen this slide before, but I've added in some carbon pricing here. So this is the carbon income working on £15 a tonne £15 per tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it can show what a farm might be able to produce or might be able to gain if this was the case in the future. So current barriers, it's consistency in accounting methodology. So we're not the only farm carbon calculator out there. There's many others. We always suggest pick one and then use whichever one you use consistently, because there is variances in methodology. There is a lack of clarity in potential carbon sequestration. So as ever, it's the argument of modelling versus measuring. So if you can get out in the field and measure your organic matters, it makes it a lot easier, but there's always the ability to make assumptions on national data. And then lack of policy and next steps. So hopefully it's something that we'll have answers sooner or later in the next sort of round of policy released, but it's an exciting time to be involved and definitely to understand what you could be looking at. And then again, simplification of farming systems with the methane methodology. Hopefully this will be something that we can sort of clarify, that we're not all out here polluting the world through agriculture. But as ever, it's an evolving science, so watch this space. So to conclude, measuring farm emissions are very useful, and it's very important to optimise our resources used on farm. But as ever, our changing policy requirements probably emphasise our requirement to understand our own natural capital and our own ecological assets, so we can be in a position to measure them, know the value, and then move forward in the next rounds. So soil health and building fertility, never a bad idea, and if you can aid your carbon sequestration, it has the potential for a future economic market. So any questions will be happily received, and look for a bit of a discussion later. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. That was really interesting and spectacularly brought in under 20 minutes. So well done for sticking to the brief. Yeah, so that's good. Just to reiterate, if you can log your questions in the Q&A box, we'll come back to that after our next speaker. So I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague Nick White, who's the Principal Advisor for Biodiversity Net Gain in Natural England, who will take us through this other exciting element of how land use can be transformed by these initiatives. So Nick, thank you very much. Over to you.
Many thanks indeed, Brian, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Brian mentioned, my name is Nick White. I'm Principal Advisor for Net Gain in Natural England, and just wanted to run through about Biodiversity Net Gain. Firstly, kind of setting out, for those who are unfamiliar with it, just what is meant by Biodiversity Net Gain. Secondly, talking about the potential, where we are with policy, current developments on Biodiversity Net Gain, and then to conclude with the kind of the potential opportunity this presents to farmers and other land managers as well. So certainly here in Natural England, we see net gain as potentially being a real transformational opportunity, something that can really transform the approach to development so that it actually delivers benefits to nature, but in doing so also delivers benefits to people, their experience of nature, and to the places, the environments in which we live and work. And then lastly, also provides economic benefits in terms of potential money going into rural economies, but also to help to make the whole development process rather smoother and less prone to conflict. And in that, I think there's some real opportunities for farmers and landowners as well, in terms of its potential to deliver long-term sustainable income, offering into a kind of fast-growing market opportunity, and one that's growing almost on a kind of daily basis, and also in doing so contributing to nature's recovery. And I'll talk about that a bit further later on as well. So but to start with, when we're talking about net gain, what are we actually talking about? What is net gain? So it's an approach to development and or land management, focus on development at this stage, that leaves the natural environment in a measurably better state than it was beforehand. And I've underlined that word measurably because that's important, and we'll come back to that in a bit. What it doesn't do is it doesn't change existing environmental protections or legal requirements. So it doesn't affect anything around designations, for example, or protected species. It's also an approach that's not applicable to irreplaceable habitats. They are by their nature irreplaceable, they cannot be gained. But it applies to all other types of nature, be it very significant, or be it things such as kind of individual street trees and the like as well. And I like to think of the world in fairly simple terms. So this is my interpretation of net gain through the medium of Lego. So I live in London, in an area of Lewisham, and the first illustration, the first picture is quite similar, a familiar scenario to me. So you've got an area of existing habitat, in this case, an area of Lego Woodland. It's been lost to development. The tower block's gone up, block of flats. The nature that was there has gone, and you've created a net loss in terms of the biodiversity. One of the first projects to try and move beyond that was actually High Speed 2, which said actually that's not good enough. They as a project committed to say they want to try and leave nature in the state they found it. And so they were aiming for no net loss, which was to try and put back an equivalent amount of nature as they were having an impact on the project. That was an important move, but it was in no way sufficient to address the kind of ecological biodiversity crisis that we know we're in. And so what Biodiversity Net Gain is doing is it's actually going significantly beyond that and saying, actually, we can't just leave a like for like. We will continue to see and experience an onward decline in biodiversity. We need to be making a positive contribution back. So we need to be leaving more nature than was there in the first instance. So in this example, you've got the development, but also woodland's gone back, and there's some additional woodland going in there as well. So it's about creating a positive legacy, a positive extra amount of nature as a consequence of the development process. And I think this is a really significant paradigm shift, because the reason that top example is circled in red is that most developments which are entirely legally compliant, they're doing nothing wrong, deliver that outcome, they deliver a net loss. And so we're talking about something that does seek to try and transform development's impact upon the natural environment. And I stressed about the fact that net gains need to be measurable. And this is where a metric comes in, because a metric is fundamental to net gain. What the metric does is a mechanism for providing a standardized way of calculating baselines and forecasting, predicting biodiversity outcomes as well. A good metric should provide confidence. It should be underpinned by robust science and evidence. And the more people are using the same metric, so to Emma's point about different types of calculators, the more people using the same one, the greater consistency there's going to be as well. And any metric needs to be simple yet sound. It needs to be something that developers, landowners, planners can understand, but also be underpinned by robust science. And I'll come on to talk about the metric a little bit more, because the world is moving towards a very standardized metric as well, and one I think that you may start to become increasingly familiar with. But where are we now in terms of policy? So before talking about the Environment Bill, which is the kind of big show in town, if you like, I do want to stress that actually a lot of biodiversity net gain is already starting to happen, and it's already, if you like, allowed through the National Planning Policy Framework. So NPPF first talked about biodiversity net gain back in 2012. At the time, you'd see very few examples of it actually being delivered in practice, and that remains fairly consistent until quite recently, when NPPF was updated and strengthened. And it talked about, rather than saying net gains where possible, it took away the phrase of where possible, and it also began to talk about a measurable net gain. And that has given a number of planning authorities confidence to begin to actually set out local plan requirements for developments in their local plan. So you're beginning to see around the country now, led through the local plan making process, growing numbers of developments being asked to deliver a biodiversity net gain outcome. Alongside that, there's also been some updated guidance, so planning practice guidance, national design codes, the National Infrastructure Strategy and the National Infrastructure Commission's design codes all now talk about biodiversity net gain. So there is a growing drive both across the kind of residential and infrastructure worlds to say, actually, we're expecting projects to start to deliver net gain. And that's also being reinforced by some of the emerging national policy statements as well, who are again starting to pick up on this idea of expecting projects to deliver a biodiversity net gain outcome. But the big game in town is the Environment Bill, because the Environment Bill is introducing a proposed mandatory requirement for all developments that fall under the Town and Country Planning Act in England to deliver a biodiversity net gain outcome. So this would require a minimum 10% net gain as calculated using a standardized biodiversity metric. So I mentioned earlier about a move towards a standardized metric. I'll talk about the metric a bit more in a minute, but moving everyone towards this standardized metric. And so most developments will find that they are going to need to start doing this. It also requires that habitats created or enhanced through this process are secured for at least 30 years. It introduces a kind of a spatial hierarchy in terms of how net gain should be delivered as well. So the bill emphasises that developments in the first instance to try and achieve net gains within their site boundary, within their red line. But it recognises that in many instances it won't be ecologically possible, or it might not meet the scheme design to do that, in which case there's opportunities then to deliver net gain on site. And this is very much where farmers and other landowners come in. This opportunity to potentially be delivering net gains for developers on your own lands to help that development achieve the biodiversity net gain outcome they need to do, courtesy of this bill. There's also a third mechanism, which is where there isn't availability through the private market, and so developers could, as a last resort, purchase statutory biodiversity credits from government. But the expectation is most delivery will be on site or through people such as yourselves and your clients. A national register for net gain sites is being set up. So similar to Andrew was talking about a carbon registry, there will be a national net gain registry. So anyone that's offering land for the purposes of delivering net gain on will need to get that onto that national register. And biodiversity net gain, this legal requirement for developments under the Town and Country Planning Act, is likely to become law in the second half of 2023. Again, to re-emphasise, it doesn't change existing legal protections. And at the moment, there's no proposals in the bill for it to include national significant infrastructure projects or marine. But both of those have got work underway looking at how net gain could be applied to those as well. So just to recap, there's three proposed mechanisms for delivering biodiversity net gain through the bill. One is on-site through enhanced green infrastructure. Secondly, and more of interest to yourself, though, is actually the opportunities to deliver off-site, and that's through the creation of new habitats or enhancements of existing ones, either on individual land holdings, through partnerships, or through the creation of habitats up front and establishing them as habitat banks. And then lastly, there's this third kind of option of last resort, if you like, of providing statutory credits from government. And again, that will be provided through arrangements with landowners and land managers to offer kind of strategic landscape scale solutions to developers. The bill is still going through Parliament, and a lot of the detail of it is still to be set out in secondary legislation and regulations. So there's a lot more information still to come. There will be a government consultation this summer, and that covers things such as the details of the Biodiversity Net Gain plan the developer needs to submit, any exemptions to the requirements, how phased developments will be treated, what constitutes an irreplaceable habitat, for example. More interest to yourself, things such as the Net Gain register, what will that look like, what will be needed, what will be required to register on that. And then also setting out some thinking around this question, which Andrew touched on in detail, around additionality. So there's a similar requirement for additionality within Biodiversity Net Gain. And there'll be questions around how that could work in practice and to what extent biodiversity net gain could work with things like carbon or nutrient trading to allow for stacking or bundling of the sales of different services. So do look out for that consultation and do respond to it, because it will help to shape how this market in biodiversity net gain units operates and how it relates to things like the carbon market and the nitrates market. I mentioned that it's all going to be underpinned by a standardized metric, which will be called Biodiversity Metric 3. The imagery on the screen is actually screenshots of a beta metric that's been out for a couple of years now, version 2, which a number of people probably are familiar with. And version 3 basically updates that beta version 2. It will be released early this summer, so we're hoping to get it published in July, but it was coming out very soon. And what it does is it uses habitat features as a proxy measure for wider biodiversity. So it doesn't consider species, for example, it's all based on habitat features. And it considers the location of those features, the condition of those features, how important they are in terms of their nature value, and then translates that into a language of biodiversity unit. So you'll often hear things described in biodiversity unit terms, and that's basically the currency of the metric. It applies to all terrestrial habitat types, so everything from something with no biodiversity value, so hard standing, or kind of like an area of concrete is in there, all the way through to very high distinctive habitats. It includes things such as very urban features like street trees, green roofs, all the way, and also includes things such as some of the kind of more farmland features as well. It applies to both linear and area habitats. So there's a separate section that deals with hedgerows and lines of trees, and also a separate calculation that deals with rivers and streams as well. And when version 3 comes out, it will also have a GIS import facility, so allowing for the kind of bulk import of GIS data to help facilitate calculations. And the metric can be applied in a whole range of scenarios. So at very macro scales, so to kind of landscape scale schemes, all the way through to very kind of micro level interventions, such as small urban SUD schemes. It can be applied to large or small developments. And it's the sort of thing that landowners who are wanting to make biodiversity available for sale for developers to buy will need to start becoming familiar with, because it's the mechanism by which they calculate the baseline and then the potential uplift value of their land that they can then sell to developers who need some of those off-site biodiversity units. So this is the indicative timetable for the bill. I say indicative because there has been some chopping and changing, particularly due to COVID, around timings. But Metric 3 is likely to be released in, that should say, early summer rather than late early summer of 2021. As I mentioned, the secondary legislation consultation during the summer. The bill itself will get royal assent in 2021. And then will the mandatory net gain requirement will kick in about 2 years or 2 years after that, so towards the autumn of 2023. It's also worth drawing attention to the local nature recovery strategies that are also set out in the bill, because they potentially act as a targeting mechanism. So if you're delivering biodiversity outcomes that have been identified locally through an LNRS as being really important, or if you're in a priority location, in a kind of mapped spatial location that the local nature recovery strategy highlights, the metric incentivizes delivery on your land or towards those features as well. So it's worth engaging with these local nature recovery strategies. So I think net gain potentially is a significant opportunity for farmers and landowners. Firstly, it offers a potential for your land holdings to be the solution to developers' net gain problem. So particularly if they're not able to achieve net gain on their sites, they will be looking for opportunities, and they already are looking for opportunities to enter into contracts with people to deliver the biodiversity units they need. Growing number of developers already doing this. Some are doing voluntarily, some because there's existing local plan requirements, but as I mentioned, come second half of 2023, most developments will legally need to do this. And so there is a growing market and a growing expectation that this is going to be quite a significant change. And DEFRA's estimates are that the potential market size is somewhere between 160 to 320 million pounds per annum, so a not insignificant market. And that's because, as I said, it will apply to most developments in late 23 onwards. So as landowners, some things to be thinking about now. Firstly, begin to identify, or we're thinking about identifying land parcels that might be suitable for habitat creation or enhancements. Secondly, think about whether you actually want to start the work now. If you do start the work now and set yourself up as what's called a habitat bank, you do actually get rewarded for doing that because you have reduced the risk that that habitat is less likely to fail. Basically, there's more certainty associated with it. So the earlier you commence habitat works, and then the more you can get rewarded through the system. There is some existing guidance out there. So Syria, Simon, IEMA published some best practice principles and some more detailed guidance last year. And there is a British standard for the process standard for biodiversity net gain, BS 8683, which is just about to be published as well. So that's also worth referring to. Familiarise yourselves with the metric and undertake some indicative metric calculations just to ascertain what the potential uplift that could be possible from your land is. And then be thinking about registering your land on this National Net Gain Register when it becomes available. It's currently being developed and it's likely to go live sometime towards the end of 2022. Be thinking about the sale price as well. So I mentioned that the bill requires net gains to be managed and secured for at least 30 years. This means that as landowners, you can charge all the associated costs related to habitat creation and maintenance for that 30-year period. So that includes your management costs, your survey costs, your monitoring costs, your legal costs. That should all be reflected in your price back to developers. Before entering into any final contracts, you'll need to do a kind of final metric calculation with a developer. And then you enter into one of these 30-year agreements. They need to be legally secured. So that will mean either through a planning obligation or a conservation covenant, which again is a new legal mechanism that's coming in through the Environment Bill. And then there'll be an expectation to undertake periodic monitoring and reporting over the duration of that 30-year time frame. But again, it is reasonable for you to be including that in the price that you're charging for developers when you're selling those units to them. So just to finish off, some three considerations for landowners. Andrew made this point as well: location, location, location. Where you are in respect to the development does have a bearing in terms of whether developers are going to be wanting to try and contract with you. The way the metric works, it incentivizes delivery of net gain quite close to the development site. So the closer you are to the development, the more attractive your land is going to be to developers to deliver that gain on when they can't deliver it on their own land. It doesn't preclude delivery further afield, but there is a relationship between that local location. Focus on the strategic priorities. So think about what's in the local plans in terms of the local nature recovery strategies. How are you delivering against those? Because again, you doing that, that gives you a positive outcome in terms of for net gain. And then finally, start work early as well. This idea of setting yourself up as a habitat bank, commencing habitat works in advance, you will be rewarded for doing that through the way that the biodiversity metric works. So thank you, Brian. Sorry, that was slightly over, but that's me.
Lovely, Nick. Thank you very much. And I think on my clock, you were just on the minute. So well done for being as close to the allotted time as you can be. So really good. I think what we've had both from Nick, Emma, and Andrew are some very detailed concepts and initiatives that are moving ahead and providing what I hope will be significant resources. So Nick, you mentioned some sums there, which looks spectacularly interesting on an annual basis. The opportunity coming from Woodland and carbon capture generally looks really interesting. But I think equally what it does, there you go, your timer has just gone. It indicates also the need to have, if you like, an intelligent approach to how these things are packaged and delivered. So in terms of what our side of the fence is looking like, it really strengthens and makes the case even stronger to have people who can lead the way, facilitate this change through the knowledge transfer that's required. And I think, no disrespect to anybody, but to expect land managers and farmers who might not have the same focus or the reach of knowledge about policy and developments really boosts the role of the facilitator in this picture. So I'm really pleased that there's some real meat and content in terms of the policy. It's no longer just words and good intentions, but some serious resource starting to materialise that will help to drive this change. So really good to hear from you. I think, excuse me, that was actually a motorbike, it wasn't me. Yes, some really good content that I think is reflected. We've got a list, I think, of over 25 questions that have been submitted. I think there's a few more that's popped up in the chat because people have been doing their own thing. So Anne, I'll hand over to you to field the first question to the presenters. But thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Some fantastic presentations there. So we have got quite a lot of questions to get through, and we'll see how we go. But if I sort of jump back to the beginning, really questions for you, Andy. Would you be able to explain where the new EWCO launched yesterday fits in with the Woodland Carbon Code?
No, it's a good point. So as each country has its own grant schemes, you basically, when you're considering carbon units, again, it's that additionality point that Nick reflected as well. If your grant and any subsequent income that you're getting isn't more lucrative than your current land use, then you are likely to be able to be assigned carbon units as well. So essentially, UCO isn't any different than any other grant scheme in that sense. I have been doing work with the team at UCO, though, just to make things a little bit easier for people wanting to register with the carbon code. So there is a facility within the spreadsheet to present you with all of the information that you would need from your Woodland creation scheme. Once you've inputted all of your information in UCO, it generates this automatically for you. So you can then just lift this and put it straight into our calculator, and that will tell you how many carbon units you're likely to sequester, just to avoid you having to duplicate every single time. So yeah, similar to any other grant scheme, so long as you pass additionality, it should be fine. We'll give you some carbon units.
Okay. Are grasslands likely to be included within the carbon code at some point, given that well-managed grasslands sequester carbon? And I suppose that's one for you, Andy, but also you, Emma, as well. Perhaps you can input into that one.
Yeah, I'd probably defer to Emma on this. I'm sure you know far more about grassland than me. From our perspective, we are the Woodland Carbon Code, and there will be many other carbon codes popping up. There's already the peatland Carbon Code, which is recognised to the same level as we are, because they're peatland specialists. So this is where grassland carbon codes, farm carbon codes may start to develop. But Emma, I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So even within our own calculator, grassland is always something that's vastly overlooked. I've been doing a project recently in soil sampling all sorts of grassland, and I think I was having organic mass up to about 28%. So it's not something that we should be overlooking, but I think as a land use, because it's so variable, it's so hard to sort of verify. So from sort of my own personal perspective, within the sort of soil carbon of we don't have any sort of direct verification scheme, my advice would be to either dig a hole or get some soil tested and see what you've got. And as the sort of policy and framework develops, you're in a better position to sort of get off the mark running. Sorry, I can't be more helpful than that, but it's one of those things that definitely with the calculators you can take in as a land use by knowing what's in your soil and your area. And also just from sort of a biological perspective, it never hurts to get a spade out and actually have a look at the depth of vegetation within the soil from a grassland. You can easily see whether you can get that going a bit more or not with the depth of how far your rooting goes. So yeah, lots of things to go at, but unfortunately no framework to work directly within it yet, officially.
I'm quite aware that there's a lot of discussions about the value of carbon and sequestration of carbon within grassland soils. And I think there's a big debate roaring at the moment in terms of woodland versus other habitats. And we may come on to some of that through some of the other questions about how we target what we're doing and protect what we've got already. We'll see as we go along, but I think that might be an interesting discussion to maybe open up a little bit about how we make sure that we protect some of our existing habitats and don't just don't go along the route of carbon. We do need to think about biodiversity as well.
Just to add to that, Anne, very briefly, sorry, as well, there's some research NE's done as well, looking at the carbon sequestration values of other habitats as well. So I can't off the top of my head remember the name of the research, but I could try and circulate it afterwards if people are interested.
Yeah, there's been a recent publication, hasn't there, about carbon value of different habitats. So yes, we can share that link if people are interested. I've got a question here. As peak summer temperatures rise in coming decades, will this make purchasers more wary of investing in woodland carbon offsets because it will increase the risk of losing their investments?
Shall I jump in on that one then, Anne? Yes, people are very conservative about it. And as you say, with rising temperatures, climate change, pests and diseases, fire, there are so many issues with natural capital or risks associated with it. What we've done at the Carbon Code is first and foremost, that calculator that I mentioned at the start, we're incredibly conservative with the amount of carbon we will ever allow you to be assigned and to sell up from. So when I say you're assigned 500 PIUs at the start, the likelihood is, if everything goes well, by year 100, you'll actually have 650, 700 carbon units by the end, but we're already very conservative with that 500 units. Furthermore, we also take 20% of those 500 units, and then any extra units we also take 20% of to put into our own risk buffer. And so this is essentially a pooled buffer between all projects in the UK, and there's been a huge amount of work into this to know what percentage is a reasonable buffer to protect the integrity of those carbon units, to make sure that investors are protected so that they can buy with confidence and know that carbon is protected. Because if it isn't that tree's burned down or that has got a pest or disease, it's okay because I can draw from that pooled buffer to cover my losses in a carbon sense. So I hope that makes sense.
I think so. I mean, not in any detail, Andy, but how does the sort of calculations work? Does it depend on what trees you're planting, what species you're planting? Are there extra units, larger sites? How, just briefly, how
in a nutshell? Well, you've already touched on the main factors in terms of the management regime, the species planted, the likely yield classes of those species, and not only the yield classes now, but also, so yield class just being the speed at which they grow, essentially the amount of mass they put on annually, but also climate proofed calculations. And so we insist that everybody, when they put their carbon calculations and their species into the carbon calculator, that they show that they have drawn those figures that they're using from ESC, the Ecological Site Classification developed by Forest Research and the Forestry Commission. So what they do is they say, right, well, this species of tree might be good now, but in 20 years' time, with a wetter, warmer climate in certain parts of the country or drier elsewhere, it's going to be useless. And so those are the figures that we're using to essentially try and future-proof those things. So, you know, as I say, management regime, species type, the suitability of the site for growth. But then there's another question later on, I think, talking about plastic use. And we also consider essentially something known as the carbon debt. So when you go into a woodland and you mound the soil, you put a fence up, you put tree guards up and tree stakes, all of those things have embedded carbon costs associated with them, if you like. And that debt is reflected in the calculator. So if you had a site that's expected to sequester 100,000 tons of carbon over 100 years, you're likely going to have to pay off 5,000 tons of that carbon debt through soil emissions and that sort of thing before we start giving you any units anyway. So there's a lot of different factors in play.
Okay. I guess this is sort of touching on some biodiversity. This next question: carbon credits would appear to incentivize planting 100% canopy cover for maximum return, whereas good ecological practice is to leave significant open space. Is there intended to be a biodiversity benefit from these new woodlands? Again, I'll come to you, Andy.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I did the first presentation. The first questions are going to be carbon. So when it comes to encouraging 100% canopy cover, it depends entirely on your objectives. Yes, if you are going purely for carbon, then plant your woodland, non-intervention, as densely packed, mixed broadleaves as you can, and that will probably give you the best returns from a carbon perspective. That's not the only perspective to consider. Carbon prices are quite high at the moment, as I said, 6, 25, 30 pounds per tonne. But if a new technology came out, nuclear fusion, and essentially made carbon units obsolete, the carbon price may plummet. So you may have just planted this woodland very poorly designed for any objective except for carbon. So what I'd suggest is planting a well-considered, silviculturally sound mixed woodland, potentially with some commercial elements if it's suitable for the timber benefits, material substitution, that sort of thing, biodiversity, flood mitigation, all of those things considered, rather than just planting for a single objective. If you ever plant or do any sort of objective when it's just singly focused, you're putting all of your eggs in one basket. So I'd avoid that. And then, as I mentioned in the presentation, it has to be UKFS compliant. So there has to be an element of open ground. There has to be an element of diversity of species in there to be UKFS compliant, and so to be able to generate carbon units.
Okay, I've just seen a comment up in the chat there about should biodiversity be really at the top of the agenda really when we're dealing with this. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on that as well, that there's a huge focus at the moment on carbon and rightly so, climate change crisis, but also biodiversity crisis that Nick alluded to. So does anybody else want to sort of comment around that? Because again, the sort of next question is, you know, is there a danger that we've got a rush here to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and it's about businesses, but we're forgetting about the biodiversity crisis?
Yes, just to come in on that one. And I mean, certainly within NE, and I think, yeah, for EA as well, we see biodiversity as being a sort of fundamental building block from which wider kind of natural capital benefits can flow as well. So so equally with the kind of biodiversity net gain approach, you could say, well, why only focus on biodiversity? Why not address some of the other ecosystem service benefits? So there are other tools that are there or being developed that do try to capture some of that broader range of ecosystem service outcomes. And I think, you know, our advice would be to actually, it's not impossible to manage both for carbon and also for biodiversity outcomes as well. And just to echo what Andrew said, you know, the risks associated just going down a kind of a single approach. So we would strongly encourage people to be thinking about how they can be creating or managing woodlands for nature as well as for carbon, and not seeing them in as kind of, you know, one or the other, if you like.
We're in quite a fortunate position, aren't we, Nick? Just generally, if you do one biodiversity, carbon, flood mitigation benefit, it's likely to have associated benefits as well. And so that's where our tool of the Woodland Benefits tool tries to encourage that, to say the more benefits that you encourage, the more public access and social gains, that sort of thing, companies will pay you more money for your carbon units. So that is the biggest incentive for many people.
Thanks. I'll just step in a little bit here. I mean, it does appear like there's a bit of a Klondike situation developing around potential opportunities and probably distorted outcomes if people rush in one direction to one particular place at one given time. So it's not unusual. We manage conflicts between land use, hopefully successfully, between the various bodies that have got responsibility. But I think it indicates that clarity and conflict avoidance needs to be a critical factor in that. And I think like a lot of what I've been doing over the last 10 years with sort of landscape scale stuff is that the local participation and local sort of knowledge that can inform getting the right thing in the right place is absolutely critical. So I think that sort of virtuous cycle of sort of policy, resource and delivery and getting the right land use change is really exciting. But I just wanted to say we've got 8 minutes left, Dan, so hopefully we can pack in a few more questions and get to the end of the session.
Yeah, sure. So I will skip down a few. I guess this is a question for Emma, really. Is there a plan for carbon calculations to be standard practice alongside an annual nutrient management plan?
I'm not sure. I wouldn't be surprised. It would be one of the things that would come under the new sort of rules for soil or those sort of style incentives, I would suggest. Standardized, no, I don't know. It would be really interesting if there was, but again, the methodology is quite variable. So I think it needs to be more sort of verified first before you could sort of look at having a wide scale requirement for farmers to be doing that for different bits and bobs. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised in the future it would be there.
There are certain companies at the minute, Emma, where there are about 12,000 companies in the UK now, listed companies, that have to report on their carbon emissions. And in the future, well, with the release of the UK emissions trading scheme, very similar to the EU emissions trading scheme last week, 2 weeks ago, it's essentially saying that these companies have a cap on the amount of carbon they can emit before they have to start buying offsets elsewhere. It's natural and it's the intention for these carbon taxes, carbon trading schemes to expand out into more and more sectors. So what we're finding is a lot of companies are future-proofing. Yes, this is voluntary market at the moment, but get your credits in now, do that sort of thing. One of the benefits that Emma's talking about is essentially insetting. You're generating your own carbon units to offset against your own farm's emissions. So there are a lot of different ways of looking at it.
Yeah, no, there's lots of schemes, as you say, even on a farm scale of offsetting at the minute, but it's just lacking that verification. So it's all currently counted as voluntary, as you say. So I'd be waiting for it to be verified before they make it legislative.
Just a couple of questions together here. How do you measure soil organic matter, and does your sequestration tool take into account multi-species cover crops? And if I could also add to that, have you been able to attribute carbon figures for upland soils with your calculator?
Okay, so if we start on the first, sorry, this dog's just entering, it's still waiting back out again. So the first half of the question was, sorry, organic matter and sequestration. Is that right? So yeah, we can take account of that. So if you have a known field area and a known organic matter, you can pop that in the calculator and it'll give you a representative measure for how much that is potentially sequestering. And from that, you can model, if I increase my soil organic matter by 0.5%, this would increase my sequestration potential by X. Or indeed, if I went on a ploughing frenzy and cut my soil organic matter in half, it would then result in this. So yes, that is modelable, that is currently available, and I would say multiple tools will be able to provide with that. And then the second half was multi-species cover cropping. So yes, you can enter that in as well. So how we do it is you can individually enter the weight or area, proportionate area of each species, which is a nice little exercise in, in entering data, or you can just take the main represented species of a cover crop. So say it's 3 species of radish, you might just want to pick one and enter that in and see what the equivalent is. But if you wanted to break it down, yes, that's also possible.
And just that last bit on the upland soils, have you managed
to...
Oh,
sorry, yes, upland soils. So upland soils, lots of work going on there at the minute. A lot of the work I currently do is in Yorkshire, so that's nice and hilly. It's definitely one of the places which has sort of been undervalued, as Andrew was saying earlier with the peatland code. It's definitely getting a hot topic. So yeah, lots of work going on in peatlands, and again, it all just comes back to measuring. So there's lots of modelling, but you're never going to know your true potential until you get a sample and send it off. Would be my suggestion. But yeah, definitely lots and lots of work with upland at the minute.
Okay, great stuff. I'm going to move on now to some questions for Nick, actually, around the net gain stuff. So I'm aware that we've only got a few minutes left. Doesn't allowing the newly gained nature to be located elsewhere risk leaving places subject to development or land use change in a nature depleted state?
Yeah, so and that's why I mentioned about location being important, because within the metric there is a spatial risk multiplier, which is deliberately designed to incentivize the delivery, if it's not on site, to make sure the delivery is relatively local to the development. So it doesn't prevent you from, say, for example, I'm in Lewisham, as I mentioned, so it's of no benefit to me or to the nature of Lewisham if net gain is being delivered in Surrey. It doesn't prevent that, but it means from the developer's perspective, they have to purchase additional units from the landowner in Surrey than would otherwise have been the case had they been doing something more local to me. So the metric tries to keep delivery local, but it doesn't preclude you from going further afield, to address that very point about not wanting to create ecological deserts and to keep nature close to the people around the development as well.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to fit this one in, and I want to ask you a question as well after this one to all of the panelists, but I'll ask this one first. How will you ensure wildlife corridors connect habitats if developers look for opportunities to offset through biodiversity units?
So again, going back to the local nature recovery strategy. So basically the metric incentivizes delivery into areas that have been locally identified as being of strategic significance. So that could be by the nature of the habitat itself. So if someone says, I don't know, in my county, hedgerows are really important, or kind of tall grassland, whatever it happens to be, it will incentivize delivery there. But secondly, also, if an area has been mapped to say, actually, this is an important part of a kind of ecological network in this county. So I know Warwickshire has done this a lot, for example, where they've mapped kind of ecological flows across Warwickshire. So again, if your land is within one of those areas, delivery of net gain into that place, again, gets incentivized through the metric. So it does try to, doesn't prevent you from delivering elsewhere, but just try to nudge and steer delivery into areas that will add biggest kind of biodiversity bang for buck, if you like, as well. But it gives this positive multiplier within the metric. So from a developer's perspective, it means it's a more cost-effective place to invest in.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to squeeze in a question about facilitation groups and how you see them being able to fit into the sort of things that we've talked about today. So if you could just, Nick, if I start with you, just very, very briefly, just say how you think, what the opportunities are for facilitation groups.
I think partly what Brian was saying, so just people who can go out who can know the sector, can have that engagement with farmers and landowners, talk through actually the opportunity that this presents and how net gain can fit on their land holdings with some of the other things we've been hearing about today. So the opportunities around the Woodland Carbon Code, the kind of farm carbon toolkit, etc. So just to be able to act as almost ambassadors and to help facilitate that discussion, to encourage uptake amongst farmers and landowners, and particularly to encourage people to come together actually as well. So to be thinking about partnerships at scale doing this.
Okay. Emma, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think I'm completely agree with Nick. I think they're just so important for getting so many messages across, and also the communication between people of you might have an idea for something and I have a different take, and it's just an excellent example of collaboration and how these sort of groups can work together to be a bigger total than the whole. So yeah, no, very good.
And Andy, if I can just ask you.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's crucial, as both Emma and Nick have said, and for the Carbon Code perspective, the facilitation, bringing people together and putting them into groups rather than having to go individually alone, isn't just effective economically, but it also allows that knowledge sharing that helps everyone, because it is a complicated process. So everyone working together makes things so much easier.
Okay, thanks. I'll have back to you, Brian.
Thanks, Anne. And just on that last point, I mean, this is where we see the multiple benefits from integrated landscape scale approaches that involve collaboration across people doing land use, and you know, it is an exciting time. So I just like to thank all the speakers today. It's been really good to have your brain power aggregated in this 1.5 hour session. Hopefully we've been able to address most of the questions that have been delivered, and as I say, those that haven't been, we'll try to do it as part of the write-up, and some of the suggestions for follow-on research will be part of that package too. Before we go, I'd just like to flag up, we've got the next session, I think on the 24th. We'll send around details of that as part of the feedback. But just lastly, to thank Anne and Liz for leading and setting up these webinars, and to the members of the White Peak Farmers Group, the Southwest Peak Landscape Partnership, and the Lotteridge Heritage Fund for making it happen. So thank you all very much, and I hope you have a good afternoon. Thank you.